to carry on with our program this evening.
That I knew that were from Wisconsin. It's not like
We're going to have three different relatively short presentations that describe various aspects of what we're celebrating tonight. Some of it's history, some of it's a look to the future, and some of it's our engagement with the state and the nation. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the evening, Dr. Louis Uccellini. Now I know that, that to many in this room, Louis doesn't need an introduction, so maybe it's better to describe what I'm doing as a reminder of why I was so thrilled when Louis agreed to take on this important assignment that I've given him for this evening, to talk about some of the rich history of this remarkable department. Louis received all three of his college degrees from our department. He got his BS in 1971, his MS in 1972, and his PhD in 1977. And after graduating, he became section head for mesoscale analysis and modeling section at the NASA Goddard Laboratory for Atmospheres, where he served from 1978 to 1989. And there, he mentored some of the giants in our field, including Dan Kaiser and Mike Pecknick, among others. And I actually met Louis one afternoon in July of 1985 at that very location, and I met Joanne Simpson the same day. Now that's an occasion I remember, but I'm sure Louis has no recollection of that at all. What? In Canada, yeah. That was many years later, so. But I'm used to that. But he became chief of the National Weather Service Meteorological Operations after his stint at Goddard from 89 to 94. Then he was the director of the National Weather Service Office of Meteorology from 94 to 99. From there, he became director of NSET from 1999 to 2013, and finally became director of the National Weather Service from 2013 to 2022. He's now a research professor at the University of Maryland. He just told my wife, Min, and I, he's been married for 53 years to the lovely Susan Uccellini. And they weren't married as teenagers. This guy just can't not work. I mean, this is a problem. But above all of these remarkable achievements, and they truly are remarkable, Louis's been a cheerleader for this department for his entire life. Now, I'll tell you, I distinctly remember that when I got word that I had secured a job here in 1994, one of my first thoughts was that, hey, I'm going to move up on Louis Uccellini's list of friends now. And just by association. And I'm very happy to say that that's largely true. We've become very good friends, and as many of you know, sparring partners on science issues. We had a little bit of that today. Although, we both lamented the fact that nobody really took the bait. You know, we were ready to go after it, but nobody else joined, so that's too bad. But I'm really, really happy to have Louis relate some of his thoughts on the rich history of this department. So thank you very much, Louis.
Well, first of all, it's true, I am flunking retirement. I lasted about 2 months. I said, no, I got to get back in the hunt. So at the University of Maryland, and it's been really interesting to be with the undergraduates again. It's a learning experience. I should note, you learn something as you're at these events. I didn't understand that John was also a great softball player, and that this was, so I figured I would just note something that you didn't include in the introduction. I was the manager of the first softball team to win the university summer championship. Mike Pecknick was on that team. And I'll just say that when I went through, I've had a pretty successful career in management, and I got interviewed by the National Academy of Public Administration after I reorganized the entire Weather Service budget structure and the process and all that. And they asked me which school did I go to, School of Government. And I said, oh, I just got meteorology degrees. They said, well, where did you learn management? And I said, well, I was the manager of the softball team. You try telling John Young, your professor who was on your committee, your PhD committee, that you're going to get platooned and get away with it. And he's on my PhD committee at the same time. So John was on that championship team too. So anyway, I thought I would, is that? There we go. So I thought that I would go through the early history of both departments. It was actually an official department there, starting in 1904. We'll get to that in a minute. But I also wanted to know the people that have assisted me. When John, you called me up on July 31st, so I still remember this. I thought I had some free time coming up, and guess what? I didn't. A lot of material in here, and a lot of people assisted. John Stremicus, Pete Pograd, Ed Hopkins. If you wanted to see the slides today, I wouldn't show it to him. You get that final check. Ralph Peterson, thank you, Ralph. And Dee Martell, Gail Martell's husband, and we'll talk about Gail a little bit later. And Brad Pierce gave me a lot of information to work with, and I'll try to get through it all here to keep you well entertained. So the first thing to keep in mind about the state of Wisconsin is that they had an interest in meteorology right from the beginning. And part of this, it was in the climate aspect of it. As the Midwest was being settled, it had a nasty reputation for living conditions with respect to tornadoes and blizzards and all that. So when territories were being settled, the first thing they wanted to do was to establish what the climate actually was. And Wisconsin was blessed with increased Lapham, who just went the extra mile here. He started in the 1830s with observations. He had a growing interest in forecasting in the 1840s. And this was happening in not just in Wisconsin, what became Wisconsin in 1848, but in other states as well. And they, by the time they got into the 1840s, they realized that the photograph could move information fast enough and you could actually talk about what's going on today and infer what's going to happen the next day. He petitioned the state assembly for a state climatology office within the newly established University of Wisconsin. But I think it took about 100 years, right, before that actually happened. So that's really complicated. He created the first map for weather systems that predicted, that would show from that map that would affect the Great Lakes the next day. And if they were to use that as a forecast, they would have saved hundreds of lives when that gale hit the ships. And you got to understand, the Great Lakes at the time was the main highway for getting commerce and people into the Midwest. That map is in the State Historical Society, and the mural is in the Governor's Capitol Conference. He petitioned, after the Civil War, he's the one who petitioned Congressman Payne from Milwaukee for a real-time weather service, that it could be done. There was some small efforts that were tried and failed. This is the only one that stuck. And it was created in the Corps, the Army Corps, and Payne insisted that it be the military because they would have the discipline to take the observations every day. In the states that were doing it, people got tired of taking observations after 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And they went that. So that was it. Lapham was the first civilian employee, and on November 8th, he actually issued the first official forecast from the Corps. That unit became the Weather Bureau in 1891, which became the National Weather Service in 1970. So I found out as I was going through that, actually the first department named professorship was after Lapham. And that went to Heinz Littau in 1971. That's in the red book. I found that good. So he actually provided the foundation for the provision of real-time weather services in the United States. And what's interesting was that there were other countries that were doing it at the same time, but they stopped. England stopped. Northern Europe tried for a while, they stopped. The United States was the only country that kept going. Same thing is true for modeling. The United States, once we started the modeling, as bad as it was, we didn't stop. So that's his forecast. It's a warning. It was put out as a gale. It actually verified 24 hours later. It's archived in the State Historical Society, and it was written up in the Weatherwise November, December 2020. Now, at the university itself, you mentioned the observations taken up on the hill, Observatory Hill. This started in the late 1840s, and this Professor Daniels, and this started in 1868, and as student volunteers started taking daily observations that became part of the Signal Corps operational network and initiated a long continuous record of Madison's weather observations. This is going to be a common thing that we're going to get back to in this history. In 1904, the Weather Bureau actually established their Madison Forecast Office at the UW campus at North Hall. So you could go to North Hall, there's a plaque, and right about 3/4 of the way down, you see the Weather Bureau noted. John Muir was actually an observer for a year. He slept in the second floor. Eric Miller became sort of the forecaster recognized around the state, and he extolled the benefits of the Weather Bureau co-locating on the UW campus. And it actually, there was an official Department of Meteorology established in the School of Agriculture, but it was a non-degree granting department. That happened in 1904. So this whole thing reflects an interest early in the last century of trying to legitimize meteorology as a science. Because at this time, as soon as people who were involved with weather were talking about forecasting, they were basically disowned by the physics, math, chemistry communities. They were persona non grata, and to this day, a meteorologist cannot win a Nobel Prize, which is why Lorenz did not get a Nobel Prize for what he did in chaos theory. If he had done that as a mathematician, he probably would have gotten a Nobel Prize. So this was not easy to do, and they felt. And if you read the original source material again that the State Historical Society has on Lapham, he did this for the benefit of the public and commerce on the Great Lakes. Some were already talking about making money on this; they were doing it privately, but this was really a big deal. Now, the results derived from this collaborative relationship between the Weather Bureau and the University of Wisconsin. Today, Madison is noted, and Ed, I've got your word on this, holds the record for the longest continuous set of surface observations in the United States. And it's from 1868 to now. It was a New York City, was that the one that was in competition with, but they stopped for 2 months or something, so they don't have a continuous record. Central Park, yeah. So Madison, Wisconsin is it. That data, I know people have used that data, said it's great for climate change studies and for calibrating the severity of past weather events. So that's one thing you get out of that. The collaborative partnership fostered by Eric Miller as a Weather Bureau employee and professor. So you talk about this combination. This wasn't happening on other campuses. Yes, there was maybe a few campuses that this was happening at, but generally not. But in here, this was an embrace between the service and the science right from the beginning. Miller was well recognized. They did these little blurbs on him. He was, and he's also the one who delivered the first radio broadcast of a real-time weather forecast. Happened here on campus from the UW Radio Hall in 1920. And I believe his broadcast was the beginning of the Farm Hour that became a big deal on radio at noon. And as a sophomore here, that you didn't take meteorology until you were a junior. I used to listen to the Farm Hour because that's the only weather forecast you could get in the middle of the day. And I learned all about prowl and pre-emergence and everything else. So it all started with this forecast office connecting with this radio station there at Radio Hall. The other thing that's interesting, and this John Sturgis was really emphasizing this, the fourth meteorology PhD granted in the United States, remember, was a non-degree. Well, he hooked up with the math department. This guy, George Porter Payne, under Professor William Osgood in the math department, report on the modes of air motion and the equations of the general circulation of the Earth's atmosphere in 1920. It's the first meteorology PhD in this country that has mathematical equations in it describing or attempting to describe the general circulation. It came from this campus. Okay, so let's get to now to the second part. By the way, Bryson, in the celebration at the 50th in 1998, Bryson didn't talk much about this previous department, but he did in a 1982, one of these making waves things, he did acknowledge that there was this previous department, and he might have been encouraged by that as he did his own, took his own steps. Although he probably didn't need He was a bull in the china shop, for sure. Anyway, Reed, PhD from under Carl Gustav Rossby, so there's this connection, this intellectual connection, Rossby. He established the Department of Meteorology at the university, and he was directed towards climate, weather, Lake Mendota, and agricultural applications, but it was mostly this climate part. The first hire was Sumi. They were students together at the University of Chicago, and he actually picked him up at Chicago and drove him up here so he wouldn't change his mind. There was also this connection with the College of Agriculture, where that first department was, and Champ Tanner on soils was. So they were very much into this. And as a student coming into the meteorology world in the late 1960s, I was confused about why would people be interested in soils, or this idea of interdisciplinary was already happening here. But as a student who just wanted to know what made the weather work, I didn't see that, but clearly a person like Reed Bryson saw it and made it work. The first PhD in the meteorology department was Robert Vygotsky, and you'll see he becomes famous in his own right as we walk through this. His professor was Arthur Hassler, and he became very famous in the limnology world, in lakes, and also how salmon find their way back into which river to go up to spawn. So he's also well known. Now, probably can't read this in the back of the room. This is from the Red Book. The main thing about this department was how it took off in the 1960s. So what were the larger forces that was going on here? Geophysical year 1957-58 and the launch of the Sputnik. The launch of the Sputnik scared the hell out of everybody. They might have created NSF in the early 1950s, but NSF didn't get the load of cash they got until this thing happened, okay? And as you go through, there's been a report, there's actually been more papers written on Bryson now and the influence we had on climate discussions and things like that. But look at their research funding here between 57 and 63 went up from 50K to 700K. The faculty went up from 3 in 57 to 8 in 1966. There were 14 hired between 1964 and 1969, 14 hires. It turns out that Bryson had it in with the dean. They just saw eye to eye and everything, so take notes. They had 3 PhDs by 1960, and then by 36 PhDs granted in the 1960s, and Reed has a statement somewhere, which thing I was reading, it was 33% of the graduate students coming out of Wisconsin by the end of the 1960s. That's quite a growth, and he was very proud of it. Now, one of the things that's also interesting with this, the success of satellites and other things that were going on here, there were these news stories in the Wisconsin State Journal that grabbed the state's attention. I think the dean had supported the state. The journalist for this was John Depp. He was a journalist, and he started with a small paper in Charlotte and wound up with the Wisconsin State Journal, and it had these front page stories on what was going on in the meteorology department. And one of them was, of course, the birth of the satellites. And Vern is known around the world, and I saw this as the permanent representative of the WMO. People from other countries would talk to us about satellites, and there would be somebody who had some connection, either directly or through their professors, with Vern Sumi, and they'd be talking about how great Wisconsin, when they found out when I was from Wisconsin. So there's the Explorer 7, that's the one that finally got up. There were several that blew up on the pad. But that was launched in October, and this is the way Vern, you take the radiation coming in and measure the radiation coming up, and you can do an Earth radiation budget. That's where the first Earth radiation budget came from. Bill Smith, of course, was a pioneer in temperature and moisture retrieval from space, and he was the recipient of the inaugural AMS Sumi Award. And Frank Seacrest, we were at the synoptic discussion today. We all talked about Frank and the energy. He was also a great master on TV. He started with the WHA, And he was the one who worked with Sumi's troops downstairs on the 6th floor, I believe, or wherever they were, second floor, third floor. They used Macias on the air, and Wisconsin, on WHO with Frank Seacrest, it's the first real-time satellite cloud animation shown on television. It was done here as well. So you had the first radio broadcast and the first real-time satellite cloud. Sumi envisioned this whole thread from space measurements to rapid processing of the data for its use in real time. And he had to convince, this is what drove the first global models. We weren't running global models operationally until the 1980s. They needed to get wind data and temperature data, and Sumi was at these meetings. He had the NSF meetings here. They all laughed about being here in the middle of February when it used to be cold in February. And they tested all this here in the building to show that they could do it in real time, and that's when the other agencies granted and ran with it. And it was the Figge experiments which showed it could be done, and it started driving operational global models around the world. And I had to put it, there was this thing, which pictures do you show, which one? Robert Parent was in the engineering department here. He's the one who did the signal processing on the ground. There's a great picture of Sumi with his team. And there's, I know Hank is in the top right-hand corner there. That's Hank and Paul Menzel and Chris Veldin. Veldin, we call the high-resolution winds now that come out of the automated winds. We call them Veldin winds. J.T. Young, I used to ride on the back of the bus with him and Lyle Horn and talk about what you could really do with all this visualization. And so this was really a team effort, and the executive groups behind the scenes making this work was just really amazing to watch. Then you have the students coming up. This is a really neat picture, actually, the Weather Club, and it's showing this interest in weather. Remember I said there was initial interest in the climate and all this. This picture here is from the mid-'60s. That's Professor Schwertfeger in the back row. There's, in the front row, is Dave Barber, who's in the audience. Okay, Dave, where are you? Stand up. Yeah, stand up, Dave. There was definitely a much better forecast than Rick Anthony's. That's Rick Anthony's in the middle of that picture. And Bruce Berryman, who went on to create his own department there in northern Vermont when he left here in Wisconsin. And Bob Gallimore is off to the left. He was our cleanup hitter on the championship team in 1977. And then look, there's the Wisconsin State Journal again. Now stories on the students doing the forecast. The Wisconsin State Journal was just picking up on every thread they could. So I'm going to now go through some of the other aspects in terms of diversity. I grew up in a town on Long Island which was totally white, okay? And I had very little interaction or no interaction. I think the only interaction I had with African Americans was when I was a freshman at Syracuse. The freshman football team was in our cafeteria. And I got to know them, got to be really friendly with them. In fact, when I came to Wisconsin the next year, and they were now, some of them had made the varsity team, I went down and talked to them on the field. It was the only time I've been on the field at Camp Randall. I met Charles Anderson because he was my first professor on the first core course, and Dave was TA. And that's what started me down the pathway of becoming the person I am in the meteorological community. I had no idea that I would be going into the research world. Charlie Anderson was the one who tapped me on the shoulder my junior year, and said, "You're going to be a researcher. Don't apply anyplace else." Right? Now, he never talked about the struggles he went through, but he is not only, I think, I know the first African American to get a PhD in the United States. I believe is the first person of African descent to receive a PhD in meteorology in the world. And he got it at MIT in 1966. But he was a weather officer in Tuskegee. He didn't talk about that while I was here. I listened to his NCAR interview. His interest was in the internal energy exchanges with convective clouds, and he supported Bob Schlesinger as first postdoc. So when I became a master's student under Charlie, I also got to meet Bob Schlesinger. And again, a little odd at first, but, you know, really realized what a great person Bob was, and you'll see what a great scientist he was. Yes, he was appointed chair of the African American Studies Department, which put stress on him as, you know, to try to keep feet in both fields, but he also lost his son during this period in an auto incident in Los Angeles, and I sat with him and he hung on for over a month and then died, and he had to go back. It was just really awful. It was just powered forward. You know, what a great man. What I was doing here as I was creating this slide is I wanted to know if we had an African American receive his PhD here, and it turns out we did. It's not talked about much, but it's Harry Hamilton out of Albany. And Harry is famous for designing an educational opportunity program that has brought over 250 African Americans into the Albany program. And, you know, over 50 years. And you read about him, and he's really all in on this issue of diversity and inclusion. So I wanted to give a special shout out for him. And then I realized with Brenda Cheston's getting a master's, I believe she is the first African American woman to receive a master's degree here at the University Department of Meteorology. So there have been these examples where this happens, but it's more episodic than things than it's an effort built upon. Okay, so then there's this famous move from Science Hall to the new meteorology building in '68. Science Hall, you know, some really great black and white pictures of Science Hall. You would think to yourself, no wonder they wanted to get the hell out of that building. And there's all kinds of rules about bodies in the top floors, and they had these attics with special passageways and all that other stuff. Anyway, the building got built. They moved into the top floor. That bar, this Roman Inn on 46 North Park Street, was where the Space Science and Engineering Center set up in 1965. You have to admit, this is a step up. You know? Although there was these great stories about Sumi, sitting at the bar, because the bar was literally still set up when they went into the building, drawing things on napkins, and then people running with them, you know, and making hay out of it. Well, he would go to beer calls and do the same thing in the 70s. You know, everybody gathered around him at one of the places on Regent Street, and they come up back to the building with these napkins, and they got all these designs on them. So, anyway, what many people don't realize is what went on in the basement of this building. Catherine, and I got this, Katharina Littau, Professor Littau's wife, is one of the, I think, 5 women that got her PhD before World War II in Germany. She got hers in 1935. They established a carbon dating facility, a laboratory, in the basement of the new building. The determined age of pollen, plant matter, from the ice cores that were being collected from Greenland and other places in the ground. And I didn't understand why they had these people locked up in the basement until fast forward to the water building that we built in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, with doing samples from air. You've got to have a minimum amount of radiation background signal to be able to measure these. So they worked there. They were there for. I was here for almost 11 years. I didn't know they were down there for 8 years. Okay, and then everything blew up. In the 60s and the 70s, she got Heinz. First of all, you got the Rossby Award in '74. You got micrometeorology. You got the Antarctic, the deserts of South America. Synoptic meteorologist Lyle Horn. Helen Horn is huge. Lyle was the 4th department PhD, and as students, we thought of Lyle as the soul of the department, while Frank Seacrest was the heart. They were there all times of the day, night, when they're helping students out. It was just incredible. And we also had the teaching assistants. I mentioned Dave Ralph Peterson is here. He was the TA for our synoptic class, and Tom Whitaker. I know, I'm sorry for embarrassing you, Tom, but Tom was the guy who was doing the computing programming that was getting us from plotting, automated plotting, to analysis, working with Ralph. He was there when I was working on my model. He would help out if he was in a good mood. I could always tell what kind of mood he was in. But it was an incredible time to be a student. And you had John Kutzbach at the Center for Climate Research and this whole interdisciplinary long-term climate, and worked with Betty Otto joined them. And they've done all kinds of work with these long-term climate scales. Don Johnson with the Isotropic Framework. John Dutton and Don wrote the seminal paper on available potential energy, which I still think it stands alone in the study of that. And then Dave Houghton and John Young, the dynamic duo, the quasi-geostrophic framework, and with all its pluses and minuses, John. I just, I did get both sides of it. So anyway, this was a great time. This was a great time to be in. Ed Elorante, I think people have seen him on the top of the building with his LiDAR systems of today. He was developing these back in the day. Every step of the way, he was there. So it was just an incredible time to be part of the department. Modeling. You had Rick Antes modeling a hurricane that looked like a hurricane. His work goes all the way through to the the Penn State models, to the WRF, and actually getting band instructed. But there's also Bob Schlesinger's work. Bob was the first one to model a convective cloud that didn't look like a light bulb. And this was a big deal because you had people like Doug Lilly who didn't want to even think about this, and even was not as encouraging as it was later when people were having so much trouble getting this kind of effect on the clouds. And Bob did his work, his PhD under John Young. And then we had real-time modeling here with Don Johnson and Greg Tripoli, which, from a university perspective, was really amazing that you could model non-hydrostatic with one and get into this whole global circulation on a real-time basis. And Brad, you were involved with that model as well. But it's still running. It's probably the most fun you ever had, right? Yeah, I believe. There's our department chairs. We've seen this picture before. This is a really big picture, I think, in terms of the power of the people who got us into the 60s and 70s. And the oncoming chair when this picture was being taken was John Kutzbach, powerhouse in himself. Now, we talk about women. I worked for Charlie Anderson, and I worked 10 years with Joanne Simpson, who was the first woman to get a PhD in meteorology. Again, at the University of Chicago, Rossby. There was actually a beginner's class in 1942 or 43 in which Joanne and Charlie were in the same class. So people that affected my life were actually in the same class in this Chicago school. Joanne never complained about what she went through, but she wrote what she went through, and James Fleming got hold of her. She put her journals all in a nice pile, and so people would actually find them when she was gone. And it's amazing what she went through, what she survived through, to get to where she was at NASA. And there, she said NASA was the first welcoming area that she was ever felt, that she felt welcome as she was working. So I went and looked. The first woman PhD was Elizabeth Ann Berman. Unfortunately and tragically, this nice, great picture of her. She was chief executive of TriSpace. This is a picture from her obituary. She died in 2008. Then we have Marian Hollingshead and Sharon Nicholson, who both got their PhDs in 1977. Gail Martell, I'm going to come to her in a bit in the private sector slide, but she got a bachelor's in a class I was in, and then got her master's on the Horn, and the Horn called her up and got her interested in coming back and getting that master's done. She was really a bright young lady, and very successful in what she did in the private sector. And then Betty Otto, please, is the fourth woman PhD, and she's here at table 3. There's Betty. And she did her work out at NCAR in the climate arena as well, working with a lot with John Kutzbach. You get the sense here that you go from the 75 into the 70s, and then it was a lull again, right? So it was, but the people here at Wisconsin, I think, was very welcoming to the women who were coming into the department. And Pat Pauly was the first woman professor in 1985. She got a PhD from Phil Smith, who got his PhD here at the University of Wisconsin. Then from the atmosphere to the lakes to the oceans, Vygotsky established the first inland sea grant college here at the UW. Stefan Hassenrath was the winner of the AMS Circuit Gold Medal. John Kutzbach, of course, the interdisciplinary. John Young was a core scientist at Togo Corps. It's the coupled ocean atmosphere response experiment. It was very clear in the 80s and 90s that oceans was a big deal, and it worked its way in 1992 when Dave Houghton, I think, brought it over the finish line as the chair in 1992. That was the name change. Then you get people like Bretherton, just, Francis Bretherton. Geez. This guy is one of the most brilliant scientists in the field of meteorology. He was Brian Hoskins' PhD advisor at Johns Hopkins. He comes up with a wiring diagram for the concept of Earth system science. Don't worry about not being able to read it. Just understand that this is a simplified version of what he actually came up with. It's now referenced as, if it's not a NASA document, it's referenced as the Bretherton Earth system science wiring diagram. This is what started driving the modeling community towards the total coupling and what was absolutely needed to be able not only to represent climate change, but short-term climate and longer-term weather forecasting. Don Johnson, when he retired here, actually took on a role of spreading the gospel of this to over 100 universities, and he was recognized by the AGU's 2010 Excellence in Geophysical Education Award. And Don also got the AMS Teachers Award. I think he's the only one to get the awards in both the AGU and AMS. But the Earth system science concepts were being driven by this department. Then you get to the private enterprise. You get Walt Albert, who was the top scientist for Visola and ran the whole U.S. part of it. Tom Skilling, of course, the WGN, from a TV meteorologist. Terry Kelly, who commercialized Epictetus. I think he actually saw what was happening on WHA. He commercialized and created Weather Central. I think at their peak they had over 120 employees, but took a lot of people out of SSEC with them as he went over. And then Gail Martell, who was the only woman in my class, our class, when we started in 1969 and 70, got a bachelor's in 71, was, really, really top notch. She wound up in E.F. Hutton in New York City, and then came back to Milwaukee in E.F. Hutton. And what's really remarkable about this is she was into the climate, weather connection and water connection to crop forecast and price forecast. And she had an incredible reputation. When she opened up her own business, first embraced this whole web-based approach in 2000. She was forecasting global crop yields through this web-based business. And she was actually, had clients throughout the world, and she was invited to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris as an invited speaker and an award in 2013. A really remarkable achiever. I'm getting near the end here. We talked about the Wisconsin idea, and I didn't even know about the Wisconsin idea when I was a student. Nobody talked about it. Nobody knew. But we felt it, because when it was explained to me, maybe 20 years later, I said, this is what we're doing as public service in the government every day. Expanding our science-based abilities, whether it's for decision-making at the government level, societal level, business level. But I thought that what John Zillman did was actually, really set the bar high from a global perspective. I think everybody's heard of Resolution 40 on the free and unrestricted exchange of essential meteorological data and related products. And what it took to get that through the WMO, he was the president of the WMO when that happened. He made it happen. When we updated that in 2019 to get this unified data policy and to then do a special statement for the private sector to embrace them, because this has to involve the whole community. We were in constant contact with them. We didn't understand how we got it through. All right, this was really an amazing thing. I was told by people like Lance Bozart that this Resolution 40 is really the foundation for the data sharing within the international research community. I always thought about it in terms of the operational community, but the research community as well. And it really set the stage for the global community working together, operations and research. My last slide, and this is why I didn't want you to review it, because this is a tribute. I think people don't give the Wisconsin State Climatology Office enough recognition or credit for what they've been able to do. I mean, getting that long continuous record didn't happen by accident. That headline there from the Milwaukee Journal and Sentinels stuck for years without funding. Okay, Wisconsin State Climatologist Office is now open for business. When the 100-year anniversary of the Weather Service was celebrated in 1970, that's Hans Rosendahl, state climatologist on the right-hand side of Governor Knowles. He was well recognized as an authority for the farm community as an example. But it's amazing what they do without pay. And on the right-hand side, you see Edward, you get that top building even today. That's above, not only above the fold, it's by the headline, the Iceman. That's Ed Hopkins. He's still doing the freeze and the breakout of the lake by walking the shores with binoculars, coming up on tall buildings, looking out, there, and being very exact for when these things. That's a climate record, folks. That's being factored into the climate change. And I want to recognize Steve Bauer. You here? I thought he was here. Yeah, he is. He's now the research climatologist. We were working for where the three of you were in the same picture at the same time. And the only one that John Stremicus could find was at the beer call. And there they are, right? And that's my wife Susie on the right-hand side. We're all having a good time on one of our visits there. We always try to make our visits on a Friday afternoon so you know it's the beer call. So for you young folks in the back, that's where the business is really done. This is where I was mentoring students, hooking them up with employment opportunities, at various forecast offices. This is all happening at the beer call. But congratulations to the state climatologist. You really deserve all the credit. And this is another great illustration of what the Wisconsin idea is all about. These are my reflections. The department advanced the science in so many different ways. Science and revolutionizing technologies. They were the most, not only did they care about us as students, but they had empathy for us. They really understood our needs at times. It was just amazing. And they produce leaders throughout the enterprise that connects the science and technology advances to make the life better for citizens of the state, county, and the globe. So a true reflection of the Wisconsin idea. I'm forever thankful for being part of that. And I believe if these folks were here today, they'd be so proud of what's happened over the past 25 years that you've just reported on and the hope for the future. So thank you very much, folks.